σε αυτή την πρώτη εκδήλωση αυτής της νέας σειράς που ξεκίνησαν οι Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης. Ονομάζομαι Στέφανος Γκαντόλφο και μαζί με την Άννα-Ειρήνη Μπάκα έχω την τιμή να είμαι ένας από τους συνεπιμελητές αυτής της νέας σειράς. Πριν δώσω το λόγο στην Άννα που θα σας μιλήσει λίγο για τον συγγραφέα, που είναι πολύ μεγάλη μας τιμή να έχουμε τον Μάικλ Πιούετ από το Χάρβαρντ σήμερα εδώ μαζί μας. Θα ήθελα να σας πω δύο πράγματα για αυτή τη σειρά, αυτό το καινούριο εγχείρημα που πήρε την πρωτοβουλία οι Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης λιγότερο από 1,5 χρόνο πριν. Και πραγματικά είμαστε πάρα πολύ περήφανοι που σε ένα τόσο σύντομο χρονικό διάστημα έχουμε καταφέρει να παράξουμε αυτό το πρώτο βιβλίο που είναι και αφορμή που βρισκόμαστε σήμερα, αλλά και ο δεύτερος τίτλος, ο οποίος μόλις βγήκε πριν από λίγες ημέρες. Η νέα αυτή σειρά με αντικείμενο τον κινέζικο πολιτισμό και την κινέζικη σκέψη είναι ουσιαστικά ένας εισαγωγικός διάλογος για το ελληνικό κοινό με αυτόν τον πολύ πλούσιο και μεγάλο πολιτισμό που μπορεί να μας φαίνεται πάρα πολύ μακρινός και πάρα πολύ δύσκολος να τον καταλάβουμε. Και γι' αυτό το λόγο αποφασίσαμε με την Άννα να εστιάσουμε σε πολλά και διαφορετικά πεδία για τη γλώσσα, την τέχνη, την φιλοσοφία και την πολιτική που είναι οι πρώτοι δύο όροι. Και το κάναμε με το σκεπτικό ότι οι Κινέζοι έχουν έναν δικό τους τρόπο σκέψης, τις δικές τους έννοιες, τις δικές τους συντεταγμένες και επομένως θέλαμε να διαλέξουμε και επιλέξαμε βιβλία που σέβονται αυτή την ιδιαιτερότητα των Κινέζων, αλλά ταυτόχρονα δεν προσπαθούν να μας πείσουν ότι η Κίνα είναι κάτι παντελώς εξωτικό και παντελώς διαφορετικό από τον υπόλοιπο κόσμο, ότι είναι εξωγήινοι, ας πούμε, που προσπαθούν να βρούνε τόσο τα σημεία διαφοράς, αλλά και τις ομοιότητες με τον ελληνικό και δυτικό πολιτισμό. Και σε πρώτη φάση έχουμε συμπεριλάβει συγγραφείς οι οποίοι είναι σε δυτικά πανεπιστήμια, αλλά τώρα προσπαθούμε και θα εντάξουμε και συγγραφείς οι οποίοι είναι οι ίδιοι Κινέζοι και έχουν μεταφραστεί και στα αγγλικά, αλλά προφανώς έχουν γράψει στα κινέζικα. Δύο πράγματα θα ήθελα να σας πω πολύ γρήγορα για αυτό το εγχείρημα. Είναι ότι το πρώτο μεγάλο εμπόδιο το οποίο έπρεπε να αντιμετωπίσουμε ήταν η φωνητική απόδοση των όρων. Γιατί στα κινέζικα προφανώς που δεν γράφουν με αλφάβητο και έχουν τα ιδεογράμματα και έχουν ήχους που για μας δεν μπορούμε να τους διαφοροποιήσουμε. Δηλαδή το σ, σ, τσιν, τσιν, τσιν. Δηλαδή για αυτούς είναι παντελώς διαφορετικοί οι ήχοι, αλλά έπρεπε να βρούμε έναν τρόπο να μπορέσουμε να το κάνουμε συστηματικά, να υπάρχει μια μοναδική αντιστοίχηση, δηλαδή κάθε λέξη που γράφεται στα ελληνικά να αντιστοιχεί σε έναν και μόνο ήχο στα κινέζικα, για να μπορεί κάποιος να βρει ποιος είναι αυτός πραγματικά ο ήχος, και θέλαμε να το κάνουμε με έναν τρόπο που είναι όσο το δυνατόν πιο κοντά στον κινεζικό ήχο, αλλά και όσο πιο κοντά στο πώς θα το διάβαζε ένας Έλληνας, ελληνόφωνος ομιλητής κανονικά. Και έτσι καταφέραμε και φτιάξαμε ένα σύστημα το οποίο έχει μόνο δύο ιδιαίτερα μορφολογικά σημεία, τα οποία προφανώς δεν θα σας τα εξηγήσω τώρα, αλλά όποιος ενδιαφέρεται μπορεί να τα διαβάσει στον πρόλογο. Άρα, ένα ήταν η πρώτη μεγάλη δυσκολία, και η δεύτερη μεγάλη δυσκολία προφανώς είναι η μετάφραση των όρων, αυτών καθ' αυτών. Όπου εδώ οι δυσκολίες είναι ουσιαστικά δύο. Η πρώτη είναι ότι υπάρχουν πολλοί όροι που δεν υπάρχουν στην αρχαία ελληνική και στην δυτική φιλοσοφία και συνήθως τους συναντάμε και στις μεταφράσεις αυτούσιους, όπως ενδεχομένως έχετε ακούσει το Yin Yang, το Feng Shui, το Dao, αλλά ίσως και διάφοροι άλλοι όροι. Και επίσης η δυσκολία που έχουν ιδιαίτερα τα κινέζικα και αρχαία κινέζικα κείμενα, που έχουν προφανώς όλες οι γλώσσες, αλλά είναι ιδιαίτερα έντονο αυτό το φαινόμενο στα κινέζικα, είναι ότι ο ίδιος όρος μπορεί να σημαίνει πολλά διαφορετικά πράγματα σε διαφορετικά σημεία ακόμα και του ίδιου κειμένου. Άρα, μία μετάφραση μπορεί να πιάνει μόνο μία πτυχή του όρου και να μην πιάνει την άλλη. Επομένως, η λύση που θέλαμε να δώσουμε ήταν να διαλέξουμε όρους οι οποίοι να μην είναι ιδιαιτέρως φιλοσοφικά φορτωμένοι, δηλαδή να μην έχουν ιδιαίτερες συνυποδηλώσεις. Άρα προσπαθήσαμε να διαλέξουμε λίγο πιο, ας πούμε, ουδέτερους όρους. Και μία άλλη περίπτωση ήταν ότι θέλαμε ενδεχομένως, κατά περίπτωση, έπρεπε να δημιουργήσουμε κάποιους όρους. Γιατί, ας πούμε, μία βασική φιλοσοφική αρχή στα αρχαία κινέζικα κείμενα είναι ο όρος ου-wei. ο οποίος έχει μεταφραστεί ως απραγία και ενδεχομένως έχετε διαβάσει και κάποια βιβλία που έχουν μεταφραστεί και στα ελληνικά που μιλάνε για την απραγία και για τα ωφέλη που έχει αυτή η φιλοσοφική στάση ζωής. Αλλά ο όρος Wu-Wei, όπως αναλύει πολύ καλά το βιβλίο του κύριου Πιούετ, δεν σημαίνει απραγία. Σημαίνει έναν πολύ συγκεκριμένο τρόπο δράσης. Το οποίο εμείς, για να μπορέσουμε να πιάσουμε αυτό, αποφασίσαμε να δημιουργήσουμε ένα καινούριο όρο που να πατάει στην έννοια και στον τρόπο με τον οποίο είναι δομημένη αυτή η λέξη Wu-Wei, που το πρώτο κομμάτι όντως σημαίνει κάποια απουσία, αλλά όχι με την αρνητική έννοια του αλφα στερητικού και έτσι πατώντας όπως τον τρόπο με τον οποίο η λέξη ουτοπία δηλώνει έναν μη τόπο, αλλά ίσως υπαρκτό στο φαντασιακό μας, στη φαντασιακή μας συνείδηση, είπαμε να μεταφράσουμε αυτόν τον όρο σε ου πράτην. Και έτσι, ενδεχομένως, άμα δείτε κάποιους καινούριους όρους, έχουν την βαθύτερη ενιολογική σύνδεση, που στην προκειμένη περίπτωση τυχαίνει να έχουν και αυτή την ηχητική σύμπτωση, το ου-way και το ου-πράτην. Δεν θέλω να σας πω περισσότερα. Θα ήθελα να δώσω το λόγο στην αγαπημένη συνάδελφο την Άννα και μόνο αν μου επιτρέπεις, Άννα, να ευχαριστήσουμε τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτη, την κυρία Δασκάλου, τον κύριο Σουλτάνη και όλη την ομάδα από τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτη για όλα αυτά που έχουν κάνει για αυτή την πανέμορφη έκδοση πραγματικά και για αυτή την εκδήλωση εδώ πέρα, τον κύριο Σουελτζή για την μετάφραση και εσένα, Άννα, προσωπικά για την εξαιρετική συνεργασία που έχουμε έως σήμερα και ευελπιστώ να έχουμε για πολλά χρόνια ακόμα.
Σε ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ, Στέφανε. Και εγώ ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για τη συνεργασία. Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Σας καλωσορίζουμε όλους στο βιβλιοπωλείο Επιλέξη, που είχε την καλοσύνη να μας φιλοξενήσει για τη σημερινή συζήτηση. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τη σημερινή σας παρουσία αυτό το ζεστό απόγευμα του Ιουλίου. Είμαι σίγουρη ότι αυτό δείχνει ότι όλοι ενδιαφέρεστε για την φιλοσοφία. Υπάρχει αυτός ο έρος. Μια κουβέντα για τη διαδικασία που νομίζω γίνεται έτσι ορατό. Ο Στέφανος και εγώ θα μιλάμε στα ελληνικά και ο κύριος Ρωμαίος, ο διερμηνέας μας εδώ, θα κάνει την μετάφραση στον συγγραφέα μας. Ωστόσο, για λόγους πρακτικότητας, ο συγγραφέας μας θα μιλήσει στα αγγλικά χωρίς ταυτόχρονη διερμηνία, γιατί αυτό θα έκανε πολύ μεγάλη την δική του την ομιλία και θα ήταν πιο δύσκολο, πιστεύω, στην πράξη. Όμως, με χαρά να διευκολύνουμε μετά από την παρουσίαση, με την ομιλία του, οποιονδήποτε έχει κάποια δυσκολία στα αγγλικά, με μια ίσως μικρή περίληψη των λεχθέντων. Η σημερινή συζήτηση θα μας δώσει την ευκαιρία να μπούμε και να συζητήσουμε μία θεματική η οποία είναι ακόμα σχετικά παρθένα μεν στην Ελλάδα, αλλά όπως είπε και ο Στέφανος, με κάποια άνθηση από την άλλη. Είναι η κινεζική φιλοσοφία ως αυτόνομη θεματική, αλλά και σε σχέση με τη δυτική φιλοσοφία και τη δυτική σκέψη, σε μία νέα σχέση, πειθαρχία θεματική, που πλέον περιγράφεται ως συγκριτική φιλοσοφία. Βεβαίως, να πούμε ότι εμείς δεν ανακαλύπτουμε την πυρίτιδα. Έχουν υπάρξει στο παρελθόν άνθρωποι στην Ελλάδα που έχουν μεταφράσει στα ελληνικά κλασικά κινεζικά κείμενα. Ωστόσο, πολύ ορθά, οι Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης αντιλήφθηκαν πως οι προσπάθειες αυτές ήταν μεμονωμένες και πήραν την πρωτοβουλία να οργανώσουν και να συστηματοποιήσουν αυτή τη σειρά που είναι αποκλειστικά αφιερωμένη στην Κίνα και τον κινεζικό πολιτισμό μέσω της μετάφρασης στα ελληνικά σχετικών μονογραφιών, όπως είπε ο Στέφανος, και από τα αγγλικά, ελπίζουμε και από τα γαλλικά, από τα κινεζικά και από άλλες γλώσσες. Με σκοπό βέβαια την εξοικείωση του ελληνικού κοινού με την κινεζική σκέψη και σε όλο το φάσμα, δηλαδή από τη φιλοσοφία, όπως είπε ο Στέφανος, την ιστορία, πολιτική, ακόμα και αισθητική, που τώρα το κυνηγάμε, την τέχνη, την αρχιτεκτονική. Θα επικεντρωθώ λίγο εγώ στην παρουσίαση του συγγραφέα και της δουλειάς του, καθώς ουσιαστικά η σειρά αυτή εκκινεί με ένα δικό του έργο, το βιβλίο που μεταφράσαμε ως «Μονοπάτι» και που ακούω ότι πάει πάρα πολύ καλά, με πολύ χαρά. Αυτή είναι μια παρουσίαση που προσωπικά με συγκινεί και με τιμά, γιατί με τον Μάικλ έχουμε δουλέψει 2 χρόνια μαζί στην Αμερική, καθώς υπήρξε μέντοράς μου για 2 χρόνια στο μεταδιδακτορικό, την έρευνα που έκανα εκεί, στη συγκριτική φιλοσοφία που σας ανέφερα πριν. Καλωσορίζουμε λοιπόν με ιδιαίτερη χαρά και τιμή τον συγγραφέα Μάικλ Πιούετ, καθηγητή Κινεζικής Ιστορίας και Ανθρωπολογίας στο τμήμα Ανατολικών Ασιατικών Σπουδών, Γλωσσών και Πολιτισμών του Πανεπιστημίου Χάρβαρντ, τον οποίον ευχαριστούμε για την τιμή να βρίσκεται μαζί μας. Γνωρίζω ότι ο Μάικλ προσωπικά αγαπάει πάρα πολύ την Ελλάδα, μας επισκέπτεται κάθε χρόνο και καθώς διδάσκει στο Κέντρο Ελληνικών Σπουδών στον Ναύπλιο του Χάρβαρντ. Ο Μάικλ, και τώρα νιώθω το βλέμμα του, είναι ένας εξαιρετικός ακαδημαϊκός και διανοητής. Θα αρνηθεί τα πάντα από αυτά που θα πω τώρα, αλλά δεν έχει απλώς ένα εκπληκτικό εύρος και βάθος γνώσεων, θα το δείτε στη συνέχεια, αλλά έχει και ένα μοναδικό χάρισμα που δεν το βρίσκεις εύκολα ακόμα και σε ακαδημαϊκούς, το ότι παρουσιάζει με απόλυτη ευχέρεια και φυσικότητα και ακόμπιαστα, αλλά ταυτόχρονα δομημένα οτιδήποτε γνωρίζει. Μπορεί δηλαδή χωρίς καμία σημείωση να σας κάνει μια εκπληκτική παρουσίαση μίας ώρας. Είναι ένα μοναδικό χάρισμα. Και ταυτόχρονα είναι πολύ ταπεινός και πραγματικά ένας πολύ καλός και θετικός άνθρωπος παρά το γεγονός είναι τόσο πετυχημένος. Είναι θερμός υποστηρικτής των νέων. Όχι δηλαδή μόνο των συναδέλφων του, των ίσων του, αλλά και των νεότερων φοιτητών και νεότερων συναδέλφων, πιο αδυνάμων, που αυτό θεωρώ ότι δείχνει πραγματικά την ηθική υπόσταση ενός ατόμου, όπως θα έλεγε και ο Θουκυδίδης στον Πελοποννησιακό πόλεμο, ότι δηλαδή η ηθική ενός ατόμου φαίνεται το πώς φέρεται στους πιο αδύναμους από αυτόν και όχι στους ίσους ή στους ανώτερους. Βέβαια, ξέρω, όπως είπα, ότι όλα αυτά θα τα αρνηθεί, μην τον ακούσετε. Είναι ένας άνθρωπος που πραγματικά, yes, he will not deny. So, ενσωματώνει πραγματικά και πράττει σε απόλυτη αρμονία αυτά που διδάσκει και πρεσβεύει. Το «Μονοπάτι» το βιβλίο είναι το βιβλίο που αγγενίασε τη σειρά μας με μια εξαιρετική μετάφραση του Νίκου Σουελτζή, ο οποίος δυστυχώς δεν βρίσκεται εδώ καθώς βρίσκεται στο εξωτερικό, είναι εκτός Ελλάδας αυτή τη στιγμή. Και ήταν εξαιρετική η μετάφραση, παρά το γεγονός ότι ο Νίκος Σουελτζής δεν είχε καμία πρώτερη επαφή με την κινεζική σκέψη. Η εξοικείωσή του ήταν με την υπηρετική φιλοσοφία και τη φαινομενολογία ειδικότερα. Με τον Στέφανο, και αυτό λέγαμε στον συγγραφέα νωρίτερα, ομονοήσαμε εξ αρχής ότι το μονοπάτι είναι ο πλέον κατάλληλος τρόπος να ανοίξει αυλαία σε αυτή τη σειρά, γιατί παρουσιάζει με πολύ ευσύνοπτο, πολύ μεταδοτικό τρόπο, χωρίς να μπαίνει αχρίαστα σε εξειδικευμένες συζητήσεις, κινεζικές, φιλοσοφικές, θεματικές ορολογίες, αλλά καλύπτει εντυπωσιακά τα ουσιώδη σημεία, αν μας επιτρέπεται έτσι ο όρος, της κινεζικής σκέψης, από τον ταοισμό έως τον κομφουκιανισμό, αλλά και επιμέρους σχολές, όντας ένα βιβλίο, ναι μεν απλό και простό, αλλά όχι απλοϊκό. Είναι μια πολύ δύσκολη ισορροπία αυτή. Είναι ένα βιβλίο που γι' αυτό το λόγο δεν είναι καθόλου τυχαία διεθνές best-seller, και μάλιστα αποτελεί υλικό που προέκυψε από ένα από τα πιο δημοφιλή μαθήματα του Χάρβαρντ, με εκπληκτική κάθε χρονιά προπτυχιακή και μεταπτυχιακή συμμετοχή. Όπως βέβαια ανέφερε ο Στέφανος, αυτή η μετάφραση μας έφερε για πρώτη φορά ενώπιον ζητημάτων μετάφρασης, ορολογίας, απόδοσης όρων, η συνειδητοποίηση, όπως είπε ο Στέφανος, τα πιν γίνει, γραπτή δηλαδή εκφορά, να το πούμε, των ιδεογραμμάτων στα ελληνικά, δεν ήταν καθόλου συστηματοποιημένη, βρίσκαμε τα πάντα στο διάβα μας, αλλά ακόμα και η απόδοση θεμελιωδών όρων, όπως το ου-ουέι, το περίφημο ου-πράτην δηλαδή του ταοισμού, το ντάο της κινεζικής σκέψης, μπορεί στα ελληνικά να αποδοθεί ως δρόμος, οδός, τρόπος. Στην πραγματικότητα δηλαδή δεν υπάρχει μια ελληνική λέξη που να μπορεί να εγκυβωτήσει τον ντάο. Και γι' αυτό πολλές φορές μέσα στο κείμενο βάζουμε σε παρένθεση, λέμε κατά λέξη τον ντάο και χρησιμοποιούμε σε παρένθεση ένα ιδεόγραμμα. Αλλά πάντα νιώθουμε ότι πολλές φορές κάτι λείπει από αυτή την απόδοση. Και βέβαια έχουμε πάντα και την έγνοια με τον Στέφανο, μην τυχόν επιβάλλουμε είτε θελητά είτε αθέλητα κάποιες κατηγορίες ή όρους δυτικής σκέψης. Αν και σε ένα βαθμό θεωρώ ότι αυτό, όταν κάνει κανείς συγκριτική φιλοσοφία, είναι αναπόφευκτο, αρκεί ίσως η απίγνωση και μια καλή προαίρεση σε αυτές τις περιπτώσεις. Ο ίδιος ο τίτλος «Το μονοπάτι», ακόμα και ο ίδιος ο τίτλος μας προβλημάτισε. Γιατί το path στα αγγλικά παραπέμπει, και νομίζω ότι αυτό έχει στο μυαλό συγγραφέας, να μας το πει και ο ίδιος, το DAO. Το παθ στα ελληνικά είναι μονοπάτι. Πλην όμως το Τάο κάθε άλλο παρά προκαθορισμένο μονοπάτι είναι. Με την έννοια ίσως της μοίρας, του κάτι που είναι προδιαγεγραμμένο, αλλά από την άλλη. Δεν είναι και μονοπάτι στενό, μοναχικό, ατομικό. Γιατί στην ουσία νομίζω της κινεζικής σκέψης, και ιδιαίτερα βέβαια του κομφουκιανισμού, η έννοια της ταυτότητας, αυτό που είναι κανείς, δεν είναι το αποτέλεσμα της αναζήτησης ποιος είμαι εγώ, ο εσωτερικός μου εαυτός, ο κρυφός μου εαυτός, αλλά αυτό που είμαστε εμπειρικά καθημερινά στην πράξη, στις καθημερινές μας επιλογές, στη διάδρασή μας με τους άλλους, σε όλοι μας, σε όλο το φάσμα της διάδρασης αυτής, δηλαδή από τη φιλία, την οικογένεια, τη δουλειά, την πολιτική. Και αυτό γιατί θεωρώ ότι το θεμελιώδες ερώτημα της κινεζικής κουλτούρας είναι το πώς να ζούμε και μάλιστα πώς να ζούμε μαζί με τους άλλους. Και όχι, αν μπορώ να γενικεύσω, το γενικό δυτικό ερώτημα, τι μπορούμε να γνωρίζουμε και πώς μπορούμε να γνωρίζουμε. Και βέβαια αυτό αμέσως βέβαια θέτει τη συζήτηση των δύο προσεγγίσεων Δύσης Κίνας σε τελείως διαφορετικές βάσεις. Αυτό όμως δεν σημαίνει ότι δεν υπάρχει και ένα πεδίο, μια δυνατότητα σύγκλησης μεταξύ Κίνας και Δύσης. Και αφού λοιπόν και εγώ πρώτα ευχαριστήσω τα άτομα που διαδραμάτισαν αυτό το σημαντικό ρόλο στη δημιουργία αυτής της σειράς, την Διονυσία Δασκάλου που είναι μαζί μας, Διευθύντρια των Πανεπιστημιακών Εκδόσεων Κρήτης, τον Παύλο Κόντο, καθηγητή φιλοσοφίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο Πατρών, όλη την εκπληκτική ομάδα των Πανεπιστημιακών Εκδόσεων Κρήτης, τον εξαιρετικό Παναγιώτη Σουλτάνη που είχε την επιμέλεια των κειμένων μας και νιώθουμε πολύ ασφάλεια με αυτόν, την Ελένη Χριστιά, την Ηλέκτρα Αναγνώστου, όλους όσους ξεχνάω αυτή τη στιγμή που συνέβαλαν από τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης για τη σημερινή εκδήλωση, τον Στέφανο που είχαμε όλη αυτή την εξαιρετική συνεργασία και τον κύριο Ρωμαίο που θα κάνει τη διερμηνία μας. Το λόγο θα δώσω τώρα στον Μάικλ να μας πει δύο κουβέντες για το βιβλίο του, στην πρώτη του απεύθυνση στο ελληνικό αναγνωστικό κοινό για το βιβλίο του. Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let me begin by thanking both Stéphanos and Anna. Both of them are extraordinary scholars. I won't embarrass them as much as they've embarrassed me, but they deserve far more embarrassment. They are extraordinary scholars. The series they have put together is tremendously exciting. It is a deep honor for me to be involved in this series. Thank you so much. My deep thanks. No, the thanks are to you entirely. You've done an amazing job. And deep thanks as well to the press. My deep thanks to the bookstore for hosting this event, for the amazing translator. If you've ever done simultaneous translation, it is incredibly difficult, and this has been completely fluent. So my deep thanks to you. Thank you. And my deep thanks as well to all of you for coming. It is wonderful to see many new faces, wonderful to see many old friends. Thank you all so much for being here. And let me indeed say a few quick words about Chinese philosophy and why it is that I think it is so important, why I think we should all be reading Chinese philosophy, why my hope in someday in the future, perhaps not too far, is that these texts by Confucius, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi will just be part of a common curriculum that students will grow up learning. They'll be in bookstores, people will be reading them in translation, of course, but still, they should just be part of our lives. They are extraordinary texts. And to make this argument, let me begin with a somewhat odd place, which is to ask, why is this not the case? In other words, why aren't we just commonly reading Chinese philosophy? There are translations of these texts, they do exist. Why don't we? And I can answer this from my own point of view, which I suspect is generalizable to a lot of us. When I was growing up, I was super interested in philosophy. I was very interested in world philosophy, so I wanted to learn philosophies from around the world. I'll be honest, and it's embarrassing to admit, but China was relatively low on the list. I began with ancient Greek philosophy. I turned to Indian philosophy. I wanted to read the great philosophical texts from the world, and I wanted to get to China, but it was not high on the list, and I can even articulate why when I was growing up. I very much associated Chinese philosophy with a traditional world, right? I kind of thought, I want to first learn philosophies that I can learn from, and eventually I will get to other philosophies that I kind of assumed I probably couldn't. And if Chinese philosophy, I mistakenly thought, is part of a traditional world, again, I wanted to learn it in the same way you want to learn about ancient civilizations all over the world, but it wasn't something I thought that I would immediately be able to learn from. So it was low on my list, and then eventually I got to it. And boy, was I wrong. These texts are incredible. But it also became clear to me as I was reading them why those stereotypes exist. Because absolutely, you will read when you're going through these texts over and over again things that we associate with the traditional world. They will talk about the importance of practicing rituals, for example. They will talk about how you deal with all sorts of aspects of the world precisely because you are doing rituals all the time. And growing up then, and I would say if anything all the more so for current generations of students, this just strikes us as, again, the perfect example of what, well, we didn't want to do. So certainly when I was growing up, the ideology of the time, and if anything, again, I think this is even stronger for current generations of students, basically our vision was, well, we sort of knew what we needed to do to lead a good and fulfilling life. And the ideology, then and very much now as well, was I need to look within and find myself. I need to look within, find my true self, find who I really am, and then once I found myself, devote my life to being as sincere and true to myself as I possibly could. And that was the goal. And so, of course, I didn't want to do rituals because rituals would tell me what to do. I should choose for myself everything I should do. And if that was the ideology I grew up in, when I said, if anything that's gotten more extreme, here's an example. Unlike when I was growing up, students now actually have an almost institutionalized version of this. So students now can take, for example, personality tests that will tell them who they are. Like literally, you will take a test and you find out I'm personality type KZX. And once you've taken the test, it will tell you the good careers that fit who you are, the bad careers to avoid because they don't fit who you are. Dating sites now will match you because I've never done these, so this is a random set of numbers, but alphabetical way of doing it. But so the KZJ type fits well with the GHQ type, and so literally you will be matched up with people based upon who you are, in turn based upon how you did on this personality test. And the ideology behind all of this is, by doing things like this, these personality tests, it helps you find who you are. It helps you have a career that fits who you already are. It helps you find, ideally, a life partner who fits who you really are. The idea being, once you've done that, you can, of course, lead a fulfilling life. So I very much thought this when I was in high school, and kabam, I start reading these Chinese texts. And let me give you one quotation that struck me at the time that I'll then spend a few minutes talking about. I decided I would begin with, of course, the great figure Confucius. And again, I was thinking, okay, it'll be a vision from a traditional past, but still, I should learn something about it. And sure enough, one of the quotations I get from Confucius, the great master, and I will give you the exact quotation, "In order to become a good person, you must conquer yourself by submitting yourself to rituals." I mean, I remember reading this thinking, yuck, I should be finding myself. I don't want to conquer myself, and I don't want to submit myself to rituals. And somehow that would mean I'm good, meaning goodness means I become a good person following what traditional rituals tell me what to do. This just struck me as the exact opposite of what I wanted to be doing. And then I kept reading these texts, and needless to say, since you know the ending, since I'm here, I've decided they were right. And to make an argument to this effect, I would like to start with that quotation that so horrified me as a high schooler and defend it. Because I think once you see what's going on in that one quotation, it gives you a way of understanding what is going on in the tradition that is incredibly powerful. So, let's return to this quotation. The way to become good is to conquer yourself by submitting yourself to rituals. So, let me take each one of these key terms in succession and explain what Confucius was getting at this and why I think he is really fundamentally onto something. So, the self. So in Confucius's view, and this was not a typical view, so I would even generalize it to say a common way of thinking about the self in classical China was the following. Do you at birth already have some preformed true self that's already there that you should be finding, and once you find it, ideally in high school or perhaps early in college, you then devote your entire life to following because it, this thing you've had from birth, is really you, the true you. No, that is not the view in classical China, and certainly not the one that Confucius is holding. So let me give you a common view from classical China, one that Confucius would very much agree with. What are you at birth? What are all of us at birth? You are a mess. You are a mess of different faculties, emotions, desires. By faculties, I mean you've got ears and eyes, so you can kind of see things and kind of hear things. You have all these emotions rolling inside you. You have all of these energies that shift with you all the time. This is what we are. We're all messes. We're all equally a bunch of messes. This is what we are. And then we start living in the world. And then these messes start interacting with other messes. We'll just call them humans. And once that happens, certain things begin to occur. The first one, if you've ever been around young children, will not surprise you, nor will the second one. But let me begin with the first and most obvious one. Children are incredibly responsive to the world around them, right? So if you're talking about a child, I mean a really young child, and someone walks in the room and smiles at the young child, the child is very obviously happy. You can see this child smiling and laughing, and in this way of thinking, that smile, someone walking in and smiling, drags out from them, in this case the child, this energy of happiness. So they're accordingly happy. Then, hopefully this wouldn't happen to a young child, but someone walks in a bad mood and screams at the child. The child obviously is going to be very angry and sad. Or in this way of talking, that angry outburst by an adult drags out the energy of anger in the child. So in other words, they have these energies and immediate things around them drag out these different energies, what we would just call the emotions, so happiness and sadness in these examples. Now, that part is not surprising. We all have been around children often, but let me note here the implication that the Chinese philosophers will draw from this, which is that we are in danger from an incredibly young age at being passive in the world. Now, a child has no choice about this, but the Chinese philosophers will argue this tends to continue, that we tend to be incredibly, I won't even say responsive for reasons that will come through momentarily, but incredibly based in immediate things around us, more so than we tend to realize. That part isn't terribly controversial, but let me now get to the second point, and this is the key one for them. So let me return to that child. So let's now imagine another person walks into that room and does something that for whatever reason reminds the child of that first person who walked in and smiled. The child will also have the energy of happiness dragged out from that moment. Someone then walks in and does something without any anger whatsoever, but for whatever reason, it will remind the child of that second person who walked in, who yelled at them, and it will equally draw out this energy of anger. The implication of this one is huge, because the argument is, and I think they are onto something, from an incredibly young age, we cease to really be responsive to what is actually going on around us. We are responding by habit, by rote. We're not really sensing the world around us at all. At least in that first example, someone is smiling and someone is yelling. So at least the child is responding to something that is actually occurring, and even responding accurately, you could say. In the second example, they're not. And the power of these philosophers, and I think it is a fundamental insight, is that from a young age, we tend to fall into these habits of responding to the world that often have incredibly little to do with whatever is actually happening around us. So much so that oftentimes, for reasons we won't understand, we will just be, in certain situations, really angry. Well, there's no one yelling at us, but we will. We'll, in certain situations, just have a really horrible temper. We'll get horribly jealous for absolutely no reason. We have these vicious competitive instincts for what? Over nothing. And yet, it just seems to be a part of us. And that is where things get scary. Because these habits, these ways of responding to the world, become so embedded in us. We, from again a very young age, we're talking 4, 5, 6, 7, a super young age, we increasingly come to think of them as just who we are. And then by the time you get to, say, high school, we're still talking pretty young here, it just seems to be part of one's personality. Or, if you wanted to make this really scary, you might even begin to think it's your true self. This is just me. And in America, we use this terminology all the time, right? We'll say, I really did have a bad temper yesterday. I'm so sorry, but that's just me. As if that's okay, because that's just who I am. We'll often judge others that way too, saying, oh yes, well, Herman was really unpleasant yesterday, but that's just Herman. As if that's just who he is, and as long as he's being true to who he is, in this case, presumably doing something not too pleasant, but as long as he's being true to who he is, well, that's okay. That's just Herman. That's who he is. So it doesn't stop us from continuing to think, I should follow who I really am, including my bad sides, because we have good sides, we have bad sides, but we should always be true to who we are. But when you put yourself in the mode of thinking of these classical Chinese philosophers, note what that terminology is really saying. What we are saying to our children, students, and to ourselves, what in essence we are saying, putting this in classical Chinese philosophical terms, take a bunch of rote patterns and habits you happen to fall into from an incredibly young age, and then, beginning sometime in high school or college, start defining those as your true self and define everything you do, including your career, your life partner, everything according to a bunch of habits and patterns. Why would you want to do something like that? This is the absolute worst thing you should do. If what we are is in danger of being a bunch of rote habits and patterns, surely the goal should be, well, to break out of the patterns. Surely the goal should be to break these habits that prevent us from really connecting to those around us, seeing the world around us, working with the world around us. Why would you want to devote yourself to being true to those? to put this in perhaps strong terms, and we finally therefore return to Confucius, if this is what the self is, your goal isn't to be true to it and embrace it because it's you. Your goal is to conquer it. That's what Confucius is getting at. Assume, we'll get back to whether this is right or not, but the opening move is, he would say, assume that much of what you think you are, your inherent personality, may be a bunch of habits and patterns, which also may be incredibly destructive in ways we do not even see. And if that is the case, if you want to conquer the self, then how would you go about doing it? Because these become so embedded in us, we don't even notice them. The argument would be, and again, I think there's something to this, literally it determines the degree to which you walk down a street, what you see and what you don't see. It tends to define your relationships completely. There's one example, I'm sure this doesn't hold for anyone in this audience, but do you happen to have a friend who maybe has the exact same relationship over and over and over again, regardless of who they date? And you see it coming every time. They go out on a date, things seem nice. Second date, you know, this person is really, and you're like, oh my God, that has been the truth the past 10 times. That is not true. You try to talk them through it and no, it just goes through the same cycle. It ends up a total disaster. And then it just starts again. In other words, these are so embedded in us. They define our relationships. They define everything we do, which means you don't just decide tomorrow I'll break my patterns, because you probably don't know the degree to which you even have them. So how do you do it? Yes, you submit yourself to rituals. That's what you do. And here is the argument. You do this because rituals are the training by which, or the place in which, you can train yourself to break these patterns. Now, you might immediately think, and I remember thinking this literally when I was reading this stuff initially, well, why would I do rituals which have more patterns and habituate me in other ways? So isn't that just more of the same problem? I have habits and patterns, and I go into rituals that give me more? I mean, isn't that kind of like a kind of odd solution? Well, just as we've seen, Confucius is using the term self a bit differently than we tend to use it. He's using the word ritual a bit differently too. So let me give you one of the examples from classical China that will give you a sense of what he means by ritual. So here's an example. So let's imagine for this example, there is a father and a son, and the father and the son have lots of tensions. Welcome to the world. This is a very typical pattern that can play out often. And what do they do in the ritual in question here? The father and son go to the edge of the ritual space and stop. And then they walk into the ritual without blushing. Now, that may seem like a bizarre detail, but here's why they can't blush. When they walk into the ritual, they're no longer who they were when they were outside the ritual. When they walk into the ritual, the son is now the father of his own father. And the father is therefore the son of his own father. In other words, the son becomes the father of the father becomes the son of his own son, who is no longer his son, it's his father. If you're not confused, it gets worse. In one of the examples they give, this is actually a royal ritual that the king has to be following. So in this example, not only is the father now the son, and the son the father, the son is now the father, and the father is the son, but the son is now the ruler, and the ruler is now the subject. The son, but he's not the son anymore, goes to the throne and sits on the throne, looking down at his subject, who is also his son, except it's actually his father, but he's not his father anymore. And then they have to interact properly as father and son, and also, for the king, as king and subject, perfectly, without blushing. Then they stand up, and they walk to the edge of the ritual space and walk right past it, and then they're back to being the father and the son. And of course, then they can go back and the father can scream at the son and the son can rebel against the father and all the old patterns return, but then they have to go back again. And this is one of a series of role reversal rituals you're doing all the time with family members, friends, and symbolically with the rest of the world as well. What is going on with this? Well, a piece is undoubtedly obvious, but let's lay it out clearly. The goal of this is to say, if you have a patterned relationship, which as we know from families can go on for decades and decades, and they can be passed on generation after generation. How do you break them? You physically force in the ritual space each to see the world from the opposite perspective, from the person with whom they have some of the most intense patterns, some of which we'll see later might end up being very good patterns, but very deeply held patterns that just tend to repeat. And by being forced to see the world from the opposite perspective, but not in the abstract, see it literally by looking at the person with whom they have a strong pattern, who is now themselves, and looking at that person in the eye, and then actually interacting with them precisely from the opposite perspective, allows, once it happens, but again, you do it over and over again, it allows a breaking, a shifting of that pattern. Then, yes, you walk out of the ritual space, all the old patterns return, but note very quickly what begins happening. Once you do that, these patterns no longer seem natural. You no longer think, oh, I just am me rebelling against my dad. And then the father no longer thinks, oh, there's my lazy son. Well, why can't he get to work? You realize this is a pattern, and each is playing into that pattern. And when you're forced in practice to see that it is a pattern, it allows the possibility of shifting it. And that brings us to the last part of Confucius's quote. You conquer the self by submitting yourself to ritual in order to become good. And now you're getting a sense of what he means by good. Good is not that you, therefore, are habituated to being the person in the ritual. I mean, children are not being habituated to be their father, and the father is not being habituated to be the son, and the husband and the wife are not being habituated to be each other. Goodness, on the contrary, means, and this is something we would spend our lives trying to develop, it would be an ability to sense the world around you, have relationships with people around you, be able to work with the world around you, not controlled by patterns that you do not sense. The latter point is key. You may find in practice some of your patterns are wonderful. Great. You may have wonderful patterned relationships. But insofar as you don't recognize they're a pattern, it means situations will occur in which you will just respond by rote in that relationship. And then the pattern suddenly becomes intensely dangerous. Goodness would mean you begin to sense people around you, not by pattern, but you begin to sense them as, well, what they really are underneath all those patterns, which is, and now I'm going to use the term in a good way, if that's possible, messes. But messes in a good way. Messes in which, yes, we become these patterned creatures, but we're actually incredibly able to shift those patterns, work with those around us, and you're training yourself to do that with yourself and sense it with others. So instead of saying, oh, that person is just a bad person and that person's a nice person, you begin to realize probably that person who's bad, you probably have a pattern with them that you're probably playing into them at some level. And with a nice person, that's obviously a good thing. But again, insofar as it's patterned, that could play out dangerously in another situation, which means even there, you're learning to work with them as complex beings. And that gives you a sense of what Confucius means by goodness. It would mean a sense that the world around us, including humans around us, it's really messy. And when we perceive it as this unchanging world, when we perceive these relationships as unchanging, when we perceive ourselves, and sadly even tell ourselves as a good thing that we are unchanging, all of that is breakable. And if you break it, you begin to gain the possibility of actually working with the world, working with people around you, building extraordinary relationships that aren't just based on these endless patterns that can go on, again, decades and for generations. And if Confucius, one of the earliest philosophers, develops this, let me just give you one very quick way that people would build upon this insight. So if he's onto something, I obviously think he very much is, then imagine a philosophical tradition that begins to work out the implications of this insight. And I'll just mention one because it's one of my favorite texts in all of world literature. It's a text by a figure called Zhuangzi. And the entire text, I would argue, works like a Confucian ritual, but taken to the most extreme levels imaginable. And what I mean by that is the following. You will open up this text by Zhuangzi, and suddenly you're a bird, and then suddenly you're a fish, and then suddenly you're a turtle, and then suddenly you're a carpenter, and then suddenly you're a tree bark, and then suddenly you're wandering on an island. And each of these are based in these incredible stories that will pull you in, each allowing you, but that's probably too weak a verb, each sort of inspiring you to take the perspective of each of these creatures, seeing the world radically differently than the way we tend to do it. In this case, not just immediate family members, but animals, creatures, things of the world, breaking our anthropocentric perspective as well. And the entire text gives you this sense of the degree to which we are pattern creatures, and even when we talk exclusively, as he would criticize Confucius for doing, of humans, what about the rest of the world? And the entire text sort of draws us in where you become each of these. And then let me close by a key term that both Confucius and Zhuangzi use, and I think with the exact same vision, although Zhuangzi is just more extreme and radicalized. The term is joy. So Confucius is often asked, or his disciples are often asked, how do you describe this person, Confucius? And the word they keep coming up with is joyous. He's this person precisely because he devoted his life to rituals as we've been defining them, learning how to be good as he defines it, really sensing the world around him, and he becomes this figure who is called joyous, meaning that in any situation, he could walk in, immediately sense all the patterns around him, and do something to shift the patterns. Tell a joke, quote a line of poetry, take an action, straighten a mat and ask people to calm down, let's sit together. He would just sense what's going on and do things as if there were a ritual there to do, but there's no ritual because he's so good, he just senses it. And by doing that, immediately he can take a situation, he breaks all the patterns that are playing out, and people begin actually connecting with each other. And the term they will call for those moments, but also for him as a person, is joyous. There's just this sense of joy. And I might add, in classical Chinese, the character for joy is the same as music. So think of joy as sort of the resonance of music. You hear this amazing piece of music that just immediately captures you. And it's that sense, but Confucius embodies it. He's just able to act in a way that brings out this joy. And it's the same term that Zhuangzi, this second figure I mentioned, will use as well. And boy, do you sense it when you read the Zhuangzi. So along with taking on the perspective of a bird and a butterfly as you go, there's this sense of just incredible joy that comes through. And the text will talk about it. The joyousness of those who really begin to break perspectives and see the world from multi-perspectives. And it will give you, as you read it, you believe me, you sense exactly what he is talking about. And let me close right there. If these texts are onto something, and as you can certainly see, I think they are, part of what is so powerful is I think they do have an insight about humans. They have an insight about kind of what makes us tick and wonderful ways, but also very dangerous ways. They have developed an incredibly powerful vision of what it is we can do to improve ourselves. And then you have an entire tradition that works out the implications of, is this view too limited? How do we expand it? Is this too expansive? How do we think of it another way? And the tradition ends up playing out this goal of each trying to break the limited perspectives of the others. And from that reading it, it gives us, those coming at a latter stage reading through them, an incredible vision of what it would mean to break from some of our most dangerous patterns and the incredible possibilities and opportunities that open up if we really take these ideas seriously. So jumping back to when I was in high school, and I put Chinese philosophy at that bottom of the list, something I shouldn't get to. I should tick off every major civilization. Boy, was I wrong. And now I would say very strongly, these texts are extraordinary. They certainly should be at very high on any list. And I hope someday we will live in a world where these will just be among the great texts that everyone will be reading because they are truly extraordinary. Thank you so much.
Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον Μάικλ Πιούετ. Ήταν, νομίζω, μια πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα τοποθέτηση από την πλευρά του. Νομίζω θα το συντονίσουμε τώρα, να κάνουμε ερωτήσεις στο κοινό. Πριν το κάνουμε αυτό. Ναι.
Ίσως δύο πράγματα να επισημάνω, αν μου επιτρέπετε, και θα μιλήσω στα αγγλικά. I think we all just saw why Michael has the most popular class at Harvard, bringing in hundreds of students. And then something I'd like to say on top of that is I've read his book several times in English, in Greek, I've translated it. And yet in half an hour, I've learned so much about this field of study that I've dedicated my life, like Chinese philosophy. And that's just the brilliance of Michael, that he can speak to an audience that has not done a PhD in Chinese philosophy, and yet there is something for everyone. So really thank you, Michael, for that. And I would just like to point one important thing that Michael said at the very beginning, that he said that the way he was approaching the study of philosophy is not just what we can learn about these texts, but what we can learn from these texts. And I think what's brilliant about his book is that someone can read it encyclopedically and learn a lot of things about Chinese philosophy, but then they can also learn a lot of things from the text to apply it in their own lives, should they wish to. And that's something that's very particular about all classical Chinese philosophical texts. And in that sense, when you read them from, let's say, an ancient Greek analytic perspective, you're like, what are they talking about? This math and like all of these details, it feels like minutiae, because you're not really seeing it from the right perspective, that they're actually have something there to learn from, you know? And I think what Michael's book does really well, and in some sense, it is a classical Chinese philosophical text, even though it's written in the 21st century, is that it brings exactly that way of tying in deep philosophical concepts and everyday life experiences. So what might come off as a self-help book is actually so much more than that. And that's why we were so proud and honored to have it as the first book of our series. So thank you, Michael. And let's open to questions. We don't want to take.
Ναι. Και απλά να προσθέσουμε στα ελληνικά ότι σε αντίθεση με το Λύκειο στην Αμερική του Μάικλ, εδώ δεν έχεις την δυνατότητα της επιλέξης κινεζική φιλοσοφία. Δεν υπάρχει καν ως επιλογή ούτε και στα πανεπιστήμια. Ελπίζουμε αυτό βέβαια σιγά σιγά να αλλάξει.
Το αλλάζουμε.
Ελπίζω να το αλλάξουμε. Θα θέλαμε να δεχτούμε ερωτήσεις. Βλέπω ότι υπάρχει ενδιαφέρον και προς το συγγραφέα.
Και στην Ελλάδα ανοίγει το πεδίο αυτό. Είμαι υποψήφια διδάκτορ φιλοσοφίας στο ΕΚΠΑ και έχω διαλέξει κινεζική φιλοσοφία. Επομένως.
Εξαιρετικά. Πολύ χαίρομαι που τα ακούω. Στο ΕΚΠΑ.
Στο ΕΚΠΑ.
Ωραία.
Οπότε τουλάχιστον σε πανεπιστημιακό επίπεδο έχουμε την επιλογή.
Ωραία. Πολύ ωραία.
Ήταν μια εξαιρετική ομιλία. Χάρηκα πάρα πολύ που σας άκουσα και θα διαβάσουμε πολύ χαρά τα βιβλία σας.
Oh, thank you. And that is so wonderful you've developed this program. In America, to this day, there are almost no universities in a philosophy department that teach Chinese philosophy. So I, for example, am in an East Asian department because Chinese philosophy is considered East Asian and philosophy does not include China. So this is wonderful what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So, if I understood correctly, you said that you describe Confucius as joyous.
Yes.
So you use the "le,"
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, I'm reading this book by Michael Nyland,
Yes.
The Chinese Pleasure Book.
Yes.
And they say that it's not really clear in my mind yet because I've only read one chapter, but they say that they translate "le" as pleasure,
Right.
because joy is more like a state, while pleasure is concentrated on pleasure seeking and pleasure taking. So not the state of pleasure, because, well, I don't know, you cannot understand pleasure when you, it's like the present. You understand the present before and after the present, not just. So yeah,
Yes.
why do you think that joy is a state? Or just an action?
Yeah, wonderful question. And part of why I find it exciting, I mean, challenging, but exciting to translate terms from classical Chinese into other languages, in this case, English, is that none of them quite fit. And that's, of course, maddening, but what it does is exactly what you're getting at, is it forces us to think through the current terms, in this case in English, and think through kind of why they're not quite adequate. And "le," as you said, the one I'm translating as joy, that Michael will translate, the other Michael Nyland, as pleasure, is a perfect example. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the sense of this term, the Chinese term "le," is it should be one that's not simply an emotion. So for example, again, choosing words here, if we think of happiness as something like that person I mentioned, someone smiles at the child smiles, we'll call that happiness. That's simply a momentary emotion, happiness, sadness, anger, etc. Whereas joy isn't one of those. It is this sensibility, almost, to strain another English word. It's a sensibility of connection. And the connection, when you're really connected with the world, resonating with people around you, it's that the depth of the resonance. Now, there's not really an English term that captures that. I go for joy just because I think joy kind of gives a sense of that, but I certainly agree, pleasure absolutely can give a sense of that too. My only hesitation with pleasure is that pleasure can be, not as a translation, but the way we use it in English, it oftentimes can be a little bit more of an emotion than joy. So I tend to use joy for that reason alone, but I'm perfectly happy with either. And again, either way, we are hopefully in a good way kind of expanding the English term to capture this Chinese term that really doesn't have a good equivalent. So yeah, thank you. Wonderful question.
Thank you, Michael. It was a wonderful lecture. Always a pleasure listening to you. Now, I've read the book, and I found it fascinating, but also shocking. I was shocked by so many things. I mean, raised in Greece and having studied the ancient Greeks, teaching the ancient Greeks. So, and first and foremost, it was the idea of the self.
Yes.
The fact that, to my eyes at least, it was very, very fluid.
Yes.
It was.
Yes.
I mean, I thought that the self should be something solid.
Yes.
Something, yeah, that, I mean, you might have not tackle correctly in your life, but at some point, eventually, you'll get to it. You'll do it.
Exactly.
And in this book, this idea of self is so contrary to what the vast majority of us believes about the self. So the reading of this book in my opinion, is also a sort of a self-doubt experience. You self-doubt yourself all the time. And so it's an amazing experience, you should buy it. Apart from that, though, I wanted to ask a question, because you talked about patterns and kind of devoting your life to breaking these patterns, right? Right, so when you do this all the time, isn't this also a pattern?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that? How do you deal with this? So
Yes.
that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, let me begin with the first insight and then get to the question, which was wonderful. In terms of the insight, I had the same experience when I first started reading these texts. Again, I was going in thinking, oh, it's this traditional thinking. I won't really have anything to learn from them, but I'll want to know something about different civilizations. And then when I realized how wrong that was, and I began taking them seriously, this was absolutely what struck me, and what absolutely strikes all my students when they begin turning to these texts. It completely destroys the sense of self that has just become completely dominant, to the point where we, again, it's not even that we take it for granted, it's that we actively push it as precisely the way to lead a liberated life. And if these texts are onto something, we are dangerously, dangerously wrong. Now, that does indeed lead directly to the second part of your question, which is, yes. So one of the implications is you're training yourself to gain this resonance with the world around you. Now, that resonance is also patterned. So let me stop talking about humans momentarily and look at the world around us, because they'll use the same terms. And they will say, well, everything does have patterns around us. So the very movement of what we call the seasons is a product of the fact that you have these various energies. They'll be categorized as yin and yang energies that interact, and over time that will play out into the shift of the seasons. Now, that's absolutely a pattern, but of course, it's a pattern in which these energies are resonating. And so what this would mean is not that patterns are necessarily inherently bad. It's that they are inherently dangerous if we fall into these habitual patterns that prevent us from resonating. And so you could argue, I think Confucius himself would argue, when he's being called joyous at this last stage in his life, when he's this teacher, he is a pretty patterned creature, but as he will put it, or at least his disciples will put it, that his patterns are comparable to the patterns of heaven. They're comparable to the movement of the seasons. In other words, they're based on an actual resonance. And so the key for this is, when you are, and I hope all of us will, doing the kind of ritual training these texts are calling for, it's not that in the end you'll have no patterns. The goal will be to learn to really resonate with those around you. And again, they'll still use the term patterns for this, but the difference is you're really resonating, as opposed to into these habitual patterns that lock us in, that prevent us from shifting with circumstances, whereas when you're resonating, shifting with circumstances is exactly what you are doing. And then returning quickly then to the opening horror that I felt too, they would say, but that self that comes from that is this extraordinary self. It's this extraordinary self that is flawlessly resonating with the world around us. None of us will ever achieve that, but that's the ideal. And so it's not that in the end we don't exist, it's that evermore, if we're doing this, you're becoming more resonant with those around you, connecting more with those around you, and connecting more with the larger world as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for the inspiring introduction. It was introduction, isn't it?
Oh,
Wasn't
yes.
it? Of course.
Yes.
Okay, I want to ask you, I want the second step now.
Absolutely.
I want the second step.
Yes.
The first was amazing. Your introduction was really amazing. Because for the moment, I've already know that there is no true self, of course, or constant self. But this is, self is a sort of fluidity, or this energy, And this is the very idea shared in 6th century BC, what the early Buddhism or Taoism or Heraclitus say about the fluidity of everything. So you are not, don't ask for a true self, but ask to relate to this fluidity. So enter the ritual, so enter the game.
Yes, yes.
That's it. That is what you said already.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So you enter the game.
Beautiful.
Okay. So I accept this. I accept the game. I accept this whole idea. And now I'm asking myself for the second step.
Yes.
I will enter the ritual in order to gain from the game and to surrender to the game. But do I have any sort of armory, some sort of supplies I have with me to enter the game? You can use 1, 2, 3, or 4 words at least to describe the supplies or the armory. What do you think should be an armory when I enter the game? My teacher could say something to me. Just have this in mind. Your armory is this when you enter the game. Don't don't you waste your time if you're asking for itself. But I need something more. I need the second step. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for your inspiring introduction.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful question. And let me begin with what will seem like an utter and complete non sequitur, but bear with me, and I will finally get to the 3 or 4 words. But a very brief anecdote, but it's so telling. I used to use this in lectures, and I had to stop because it was so commonly on the internet. But people now haven't seen it for quite a while. So if you haven't seen it, you can look at it. But hopefully the anecdote works, because probably you haven't seen it. So there was a experiment done by a series of psychologists. This was a ways back, I'm thinking maybe 12 years or so. And in the experiment, they asked 4 people to throw a basketball back and forth to each other, and count how, I'm sorry, they just throw a basketball back and forth to each other. And then people watch a film of them doing this. And so in the experiment, people come into this little theater and they turn on this film, and the experimenter says, now I just filmed a bunch of people throwing a basketball back and forth to each other, and I want you to count how many times the basketball is thrown across. And so count the number of times. And so he shows the films, and I've seen films of this being done, and so people will count the number, and then at the end the lights turn on and the experimenter says, okay, well, how many basketballs were thrown? And people say, oh, it was 11, and it was, no, I think it was 12, and there was, no, I think it was only 10, and they argue a little bit about it, and then the experimenter says, well, did you see anything else, by the way, while you're counting the basketballs? And there's always dead silence. And then he says, let me show it to you again. And in the film, and I've seen it, it's striking, and it's on YouTube. You can easily find it. They're throwing the basketballs back and forth, and then a guy in a gorilla suit walks out right in the middle of the camera, looking right at the camera. The basketballs are going right over his head. The gorilla is like waving his arms, and no one sees the gorilla. and the experimenters are saying, well, we're doing this because people are expecting only one thing, and so that's what they're focused on, which I think is certainly true. But of course, in classical Chinese philosophy, they would go the next step and say, we become so patterned to simply counting the basketballs that you literally don't see things around you. Now, you may be wondering what in the world this has to do with the question, but here's why I wanted to say this. The reason you will know in that second step that it's beginning to work is you'll begin seeing gorillas. And I really mean that, because we tend to think that we live in this world where, we live these mundane lives. We wake up, we do this, we go to work, we go home, and we eat the same dinner, we go to sleep, we wake up, and we tend to think we live these lives where nothing happens. And actually, there are things happening all the time, including with people we are with all the time. We don't even see sides of them. So think of gorilla in a great sense, not just a physical gorilla on the street, but all the sides of the world around us, the things around us. When we walk to work in the morning, you walk by the stunning architecture that we literally never see. And what will begin to happen if you're training yourself this way it's like you're living, this will sound strong, but I really mean this. Hold me to it. It's like you're living in a different world. It's like the world just becomes so much more vibrant, so much more alive, including the people that you see all the time or something. Oh my gosh, they're so much more intriguing. Like you start seeing gorillas all the time. And this is going back to the earlier question. It's again why I love the word joy. There's this kind of just joyousness to what otherwise would seem like mundane reality. And the reason I'd say think of that as the second step is once you begin to sense that joy, it starts taking on a life of its own. And going back to Oni's question, yes, that becomes a pattern, but in a good way. Like it's a pattern where you begin continuing this work because you want to see more gorillas. Like you like the fact that the world is suddenly more vibrant, more alive, more colorful, more extraordinary. And you will see it. You'll see those gorillas, and then that's the second step. It just begins a life of its own. It becomes a pattern, but an extraordinary pattern because it's an endlessly opening pattern where you're trying to see more of the world, see more of those around you, sense more of the world around you, and it's palpable. I mean, you can literally feel it. That was many more than 3 or 4 words, but thank you. Thank you so much.
It's fascinating how you bring everything back and you weave it all together. Going back to what you mentioned at the beginning of trying to break your habits and then trying to do rituals. First of all, in the breaking of the habits, you may or may not think that they are your true self.
Right.
All right?
Yes.
But they are habits and they do create characters.
Yes.
And they're ways of behavior, and sometimes they become an armor.
Yes.
But that aside, you mentioned by doing rituals, and you mentioned this about the emperor and the sun. Well, maybe the Chinese had already embedded those rituals in their everyday life and habits. But how do you do these in our life today?
Yes.
Because I was trying to think of rituals like, Christmas or other things that we all love, and they do define our lives, but it's kind of difficult unless we create a new type of psychology or therapy where you have special workshops where you try to do these things, or so that it's all nice and well, or you read, but how do you start doing this?
Yes, wonderful question. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't do role reversal rituals, and needless to say, if we walked up to close friends and family members saying, hey, let's do a role reversal, I mean, you would get very strange eyes and they would not be successful. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't live in a world that does rituals. We don't live in a world that therefore really would even give this as a possibility. So does this mean we can't do it? I would say no, because the key is, what philosophically are they getting at when they talk about these role reversal rituals? And then how, in a very, very different social world, would we do the equivalent? And now let me get super concrete to give clear examples. So let me give a very concrete example that I suspect every single one of us experiences on a probably daily basis. In the workplace, you have a really, really mean, unpleasant person. We all live in such a workplace. It's called a workplace. And you'll say, if you go up to such a person and say, hey, let's do a role reversal, I mean, you can imagine their response. But what you do is you do the equivalent. So you begin to ask yourself, okay, this person is mean. What's really going on? Or posing it slightly differently, what's the pattern that's really at play here? And how can I begin to play a different role? So, for example, if that mean person is, because I've just started working there and they're like angry at me because they think I'm gonna try to take their job, and so it's this. So if it's competitiveness that's getting at it, you shift the role. So you go up to them in this example and say, oh, by the way, you've been here a lot longer than I have. I really don't understand how to write this memo. Can you help me? And it's amazing because suddenly you're bringing out a different side of them that you probably literally would never see. And lo and behold, it's there. We're messy creatures. And suddenly this person who's like just been so vicious to you is like, oh yeah, Michael, yeah, the way you do it is, and he suddenly begins to take on the role of a teacher. And then you keep doing that. You keep bringing out different roles that, because you've got this one patterned relationship, once you start playing those roles, it starts becoming incredibly clear, not even necessarily consciously, but your pattern with him will begin to shift. And it's extraordinary. It's also extraordinary how quickly it can happen. Like, this can go on for years, and then you start this work, and you begin to sense within a few weeks a beginning of a shift. It's amazing. Or, family ritual, family patterns that can play out for decades. And lo and behold, one starts doing this, and unbelievable. In this case, I won't say weeks. It may take a month or two, but I mean, a month or two versus 3 decades is extraordinary. And so what you're doing is you just begin to self-consciously take on different roles, and it's incredible. And you don't even have to explain to the other person why the relationship is shifting, but boy, will they sense it. And it goes back to the previous question too. That so-called mean person, they will start enjoying the fact that suddenly they have this deeper relationship, and suddenly this person that you thought was this horrible person becomes a close colleague, sometimes even a close friend over time. And so you're doing that all the time. You're constantly trying to shift these seemingly unchangeable habits, and part of it is, number one, telling yourself these really aren't unchangeable. Early on, you're telling yourself the world is fluid, we just don't see it that way. But again, going back to the previous question too, it quickly takes on a life of its own because you begin to sense, wow, the world is shifting and these relationships really are shifting. And then the other person too is anxious to keep that work going, even if they didn't consciously know what was going on, but boy, did they want to keep it going. And so it is incredible, even if we don't live in a ritual society with role reversals, we philosophically can do the equivalent in practice. And I think it equally works every bit as well. So thank you, wonderful question.
Now I feel a bit bad because I'm bringing a downer and it's the last question. It's so enthusiastic, it's so contagious. And I'm going to ask, are there any strands of antinatalist thought in Chinese philosophy in the way that we see it in many other philosophies, like bits of existence is suffering and it's best to not create suffering by not procreating. So do we find that in Chinese philosophy?
And what was the term you used? It was
antinatalist.
Oh, antinatalism, yes. Yeah. Fascinating question. Intriguingly, no, you don't. And it's not out of an argument that life is not horrible suffering. Actually, on the contrary, the very strong view is, sadly, we live in a world of incredible suffering because we live in these horribly patterned relationships, and they are very firmly committed, I mean, sadly, but I think correctly, that these horrible patterns that play out in immediate relationships take on a societal form that can also go on for centuries, these incredible hierarchies that can be devastating. So it's not for lack of realization, to use a strong word, that the world consists in our current form in horrible suffering. But you're absolutely right in the question. No, it is a very strongly, I'm trying to think of an English to capture the strength of it. I'll use terminology that captures it and draws it, but I think that will give you a sense of the tradition and this element very well. It's an incredible celebration of life through the suffering. The sense is, no, you're training yourself to alter the world around you, to see the world as fluid and therefore changeable, to see even seemingly intractable societal hierarchies as breakable. You're training yourself to fully celebrate life, not by ignoring the horrible suffering, but by trying to train yourself and then in practice, hopefully beginning to sense that the horrible suffering really is changeable. So it's this incredible celebration of life. even, I'll give you an extreme example since I've given Zhuangzi as part of an answer. Zhuangzi has, Eleni was mentioning the notion of the self as one of the most difficult aspects of Chinese philosophy to deal with, but let me quickly get to a second tough one in the Zhuangzi, where Zhuangzi will talk about death. And his philosophy of death is, death, as we've sadly all experienced, is devastating. Absolutely devastating. It destroys us often for incredible amounts of time. Sometimes we never quite really get over the death of a close one. And Zhuangzi's view is to say, of course that's going to happen, but the work you're doing to break out of that, which because it absolutely can become a pattern, we've all experienced it, to break out of that, you're realizing everything is a constant flow of qi, just the Chinese term for energies. And if that is the case, at various times these energies will take a certain form, but that's very temporary, and even the stability that we think in our current form is more stable than it really is, and certainly than should be enacted upon. And what really happens at death is that the stuff that's me right now will be eaten by a worm, and then a bird will eat that worm, and the stuff that is me now will soon be a worm, and soon be flying around as a bird. And this has been going on for eternity, or since the cosmos began, and will continue until the cosmos ends. And so for Zhuangzi, the key is death horrible suffering? Of course, but the ultimate celebration is to say, but you're still celebrating the fact that life continues, and life is what is so extraordinary. And when we're doing things that prevent that life from continuing, then the question is, how do we break our patterns to, again, fully embrace life? So a celebration of life kind of captures it, not by an ignoring of the horrible suffering around us, but by saying, we can work on that suffering, and we're often the creators of suffering that really should not exist, and that's what we're trying to do. So in the natural world around us, is there suffering? We would perceive it as such, but when yin and yang are simply interacting, they're simply resonating. And yes, winter is killed and summer is killed, but those are our terms, and what you're really going for is resonance. So yeah, it's an absolutely wonderful question that cuts to one of the really powerful and oftentimes, getting back to Eleni's question too, challenging aspects of the tradition, but for that reason, part of what makes it so extraordinary. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the very fascinating presentation. I have a question, but I will keep it for dinner because it's already past 9, and πραγματικά κάνουμε κατάχρηση του χρόνου του βιβλιοπωλείου. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Σε όλους πιστεύω ότι ήταν μια πάρα πολύ πετυχημένη παρουσίαση και ευχαριστούμε πολύ για τη συμμετοχή σας. Και θα δοθούν, πιστεύω, πολλές ευκαιρίες και με αφορμή την έκδοση του επόμενου βιβλίου, με το καλό. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ και καλό βράδυ σε όλους.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Καλό βράδυ.
Thank you so much. Thank you.